right, so we're here to talk a little. We have a double whammy of HDR. We're going to start with really, I guess, a basic thing, which is best practice for HDR on game day. Because one of the questions I've heard from a lot of people is, HDR is very much an experiment when it comes to actually how it impacts live operations and how you kind of really manage it within a live environment. People love it for movies and for post-produced content. It's one thing, but for live, it's a whole different challenge. So, briefly, Joe, let's start with you. From your perspective, from what you've been hearing and what you've seen, what do you see as some of the big challenges as far as how it impacts? Let's start with your lenses and cameras. So
exactly. Okay. So from the lens side, when you're doing with the standard dynamic range, you're really trying to get the tonal aspect of the picture up to reference white. And then when you start going into HDR, you're trying to get those spectral highlights, the beautiful images, the reflections off cars, the reflections off helmets. And then over that, the lens actually has to try and take away everything, because those are really the bad parts of the image. So that's a really tough thing for the HDR lenses to do. In terms of the camera, and this is something Phil and I talked about just before the panel, this is something when you really look at HDR, a steady state human vision. Anybody know what steady state human vision is? No. Okay, so steady state human vision is about 12.5 stops. So that means that if the lighting doesn't change, like in this room, we've got about 12.5 stops of visual acuity, of dynamic range. If you go into a dark room, that's why it takes a couple of seconds. That whole range just slowly shifts down. Or if you walk outside, the whole range shifts up, but you don't have any more than about 12.5 stops. So really, to me, that's what HDR is, because somebody's going to be sitting at home, about 12.5 stops. So that means the lens has to be designed for that. The camera has to be about 12.5 stops, your whole image chain going all the way down. And then as you deliver it, whatever gamma curve, whatever process you put, you don't want to try and truncate anything. You just want to squish it down enough to fit it through that pipe to the home receiver. But that's really where you're looking at. It's about 12.5 stops. That means cameras are 12.5 stops. That's an expensive proposition for everybody.
Well, speaking of cameras, so John, from the camera perspective, so how do you see what is the HDR production meaning to Hitachi, and how do you see it impacting camera choices? I mean, is it as simple as buying a camera that's HDR capable? Does that solve the problem for you?
Well, first of all the focus has been on UHD HDR, and that's logical. There is no reason that you can't do HD HDR. And ITU RBT 2100 specifies HD or UHD. We have HDR in our HD, 4K, 8K cameras. It doesn't matter, but we are, I think the term might be marketing the HD version of HDR, because we think it's a value, and that a properly set up 1080p camera with HDR will look better than a 4K SDR, because people watch their TVs from too far away to see the resolution of 4K. We all know that. Worldwide, it's about 9 feet. That's too far away. So that's the first part. The second part to your question is we use MOS imagers, CMOS imagers. Most of all the camera manufacturers do, and there's a huge amount of overhead in those imagers that we're simply unlocking with new curves. So from that standpoint, it's relatively easy for the camera manufacturer to create HDR. Joe?
And then we were talking about HDR. If you notice, I didn't mention resolution at all in that.
Yeah.
So I am in that same camp as you. The one part that we haven't mentioned yet, we're talking about 12 stops of dynamic range. We're not talking about the color space. And the color space is the other part of it. So if you're really going to try and do the 3 steps, it really is the dynamic range, the color space, and then the resolution. If you have all 3, it's great. It's like looking through a picture window. If you have the first 2, you get almost all of it.
So Mike, and again, thanks for stepping in. So obviously, I visited you during the NBA All-Star Game on a very cold February morning last year. And you were, at that point, doing a lot of testing on HDR. You had a little science lab, for lack of a better word. It was a nice size space. It was a studio that you converted into basically a laboratory for HDR. So what have you learned since then and been learning as far as HDR on game day? Really, what have you learned? Give us like 2 or 3 things that you've learned about as far as the big challenge of HDR and what people shouldn't overlook when it comes to it.
Yeah, so the thing that we've learned is that there's still lots of unanswered questions that we need to resolve before we can sort of get to a repeatable, consistent format of HDR. And some of that is, we work on determining maybe what best curve we want to follow for production, for delivery. They may not be the same, they may be the same. There's certainly options out there, and so in our testing, what we've been doing is we've been working in both producing, creating that origination content for a handoff to the delivery system. We've been trialing both hybrid log gamma, HLG, as proposed by the BBC folks, and also in S-log3, which is a camera scene relative curve that is most complementary to the imager, the pickup device, and creates a tremendous picture. You get great contribution of high dynamic range material, but we have to know what our destination is going to be, what our target is going to be, and some of that is defined. It's now making that transform into that space, but there's even with that, there's still some questions that we have to answer in terms of what's our points of reference, what nit level are we going to produce to? Is there something that we can create so that we have that repeatability? The tool set for operators and stuff, we need to see more development in that space too.
So in your trucks, are there HDR monitors in the trucks, or is it just, because I know the front wall, if the front wall is all HDR, that could get a little, you get a sunburn, I would think, in some certain instances.
Yeah, that's one part of working in HDR is that for our trained video operators now to actually watch that 1000 nit display, and when you hit a bright white, it sets you back a little bit. It's uncomfortable in some ways. So can the front monitor wall be that way for the producer director? Does it need to be? In terms of the monitoring display, it is about the content and not so much. We've all kind of moved to multi-viewer scaled kind of solution. So it's not where we're doing our QC monitoring anymore. It's all relative on the monitor wall. So you want to know that you've got the shot. So I don't know if the HDR has to be presented there or necessarily if it's the right place, but maybe for one or two of the monitors, but not completely the monitor wall. So, but more, that's as things evolve and develop, we'll look for those devices that can actually match up to that HDR material that we're presenting. And maybe that has to have a transform in it to present it in a way that's not going to be overpowering, maybe.
So when I first started hearing about HDR, I always thought of like the Dallas, the old Cowboy Stadium, where they had the dark part of the field and the light part of the field, and how the beauty of HDR and dynamic range is that you wouldn't have those issues of going from a dark area to a light area. So then you would think that the camera operator's job would get easier. I mean, Mike, how does it change the way your camera operators work when they're working HDR, or anybody else who's kind of experimented with HDR, how they work and go about their job of just being a cameraman, and then the shaders too?
Well, that's the beauty of HDR. I mean, that's the best example of the value of HDR. Is we've all seen a football field where it's half in shade, half in sun, and the shader has to decide, well, which one, what am I going to shade for? And if the play starts in the sun and goes into the shade, and everybody's scrambling, and it just doesn't look very good. HDR takes care of that 100%. When everything is HDR, including HD and 4K, it's going to be a lot easier to shade, and there's all that range that you were talking about, and it gets closer to what you can see with your eye. HDR is absolutely the future. I hope it comes really soon. Whether it's 4K or 1080p, I'm not sure as a consumer where I stand on that, but as a truck operator, it's got to be 4K, because I've got to assume that some of the distributors are going to want 4K, and others are going to want 1080p. I got to start with 4K. So we absolutely believe at Mobile Group that if we're building a truck that's going to be used for the long-term future, and even in the short term for the few odd 4K games and HDR, that we have to be ready for 4K, and then our customers will decide what they use. And remember, when you're doing a major regular season, even a sports event, there are going to be a lot of different kinds of distributors, and now not just over the air, I mean not just on cable, but also in internet. So we have to be prepared for everything. The real challenge, if I can go on a little bit, there are two two big challenges in the truck for HDR. One of them is what the shader is doing. The shader has to have some idea, there's such a big difference between HDR and SDR. It is a real issue for the shader. The other problem is if you ever walk, we've done a few HDR games, if you walk into the truck, you look around and say some of the monitors look just absolutely awful, and then some of them look fantastic. And it's okay during this early stages of HDR, you can get away with that, but within a year or so, or less than a year, our customers are going to expect all the monitors to look good. And so we have to solve that problem. So the first thing is we need to know what the distributors want. We've got to put out a flavor of HDR, be it HLG or PQ, and those seem to be the two possibilities. And once we understand that, then we need to provide the shader with the tools and the monitoring so that the shader can shade to what is actually going to go to the home. And so conversion between different flavors of HDR, conversions between HDR and SDR are a huge problem for the shaders. We've got to solve that problem, and I think there is a solution, but before we can give that solution, we have to know what the distributors want. The second thing is all the monitors in the truck have to be somewhat compatible. HLG definitely helps us with that because HLG looks okay on an SDR display, which 90%, I mean, you can't even go out and buy the kinds of monitors we need all over the truck. We have hundreds of monitors. It's not likely in the next few years that those will all be HDR. Right now, we have one display in the truck that can do HDR, and it's in the very expensive. I was glad to see that Sony is showing, not Sony, Canon is showing a 17-inch that can do HDR. That's going to help us a little bit. But those are the two problems, the shader and all the different monitors in the truck. Right. But we got to solve it because HDR is awesome.
Right. Mark?
Well, I think to Phil's point about the guys in video right now our intent is to hopefully use the same operator to produce both the HDR and the SDR show until we get to a full HDR world. But right now, all of those operators have typically just clipped the whites, and what it's done right now is the effect we're seeing is that it's removing the detail out of the HDR feed. So what we're trying to do is if we can use the same set of cameras and the same video operators, so we're not running side-by-side shows like we did back in the days when we did HD, we now have to teach all these guys how to reshade and shade, for the money show first, and then we'll let HDR follow that. At least in the short term, it's going to have to sort of be the one that takes a little bit of a consequence based on SDR.
So are there any tips for someone who may be looking to have their crew do some HDR, what they should tell their shaders to do? How does a shader work differently during an HDR game?
Ken, I'd like to ask a question about your question, which is there are a variety of lookup tables and other converters, graders that can take SDR out of HDR. You can't do it the other way. Why can't the video operators shade for HDR and then use those regraders to bring SDR out?
Can I sort of answer that? Yes, sir. So there's possibly, absolutely. You could just say, well, just do everything HDR and derive
Possibly,
SDR.
absolutely. I don't even know what that means. Yeah. What is that?
Oh, absolutely. We could just do an HDR show and derive SDR at the end or at any stage you want. The problem is that if you go to a fairly significant sports event, most of your cameras are going to be needing to feed in HD, SDR, other trucks, the venue, 20 different things. So the cameras have to be able, if you're using the cameras in HDR, they also have to be set so that the SDR output is completely satisfactory. So that means the shader has to be able to see both. The HDR, SDR, HD, or three things, SDR HD, SDR 4K, and 4K HDR. That's all possible. We just need to know what the HDR flavor is going to be. And that'll help a lot. But we need those multiple outputs of the camera. The cool thing is that we're starting to see HDR to SDR conversion where even though you're now in SDR, some of the value of HDR is preserved in the conversion to SDR. So that means that when we start doing HDR shows, the SDR, HD SDR shows, which most people will still see, will look better than they do today. So that's a huge plus.
Mike?
Yeah, just on that, it's quite possible even now to use some features of the cameras to create even a brighter level of performance through hypergamma and some other things. And we've had great results on some of the shows, theater shows that we've done with that. In the tool set that we're using, we have that ability where we've been practicing a mode where single camera solution, it's one camera, but we're deriving both an HDR and an SDR off of the camera, and it's done in a way that we would ask our video operator to just simply shade for the SDR show. We may not be getting the benefit of the best of maybe what HDR can be, but the HDR does do a very good follow along with the benefit of covering a brighter range. So it's nice in that we're kind of working within our operator environment today. It is a single production solution. We're not trying to do two trucks or a side by side or anything like that. And we always have to keep in mind to those kind of economics as we go down the road. So that kind of practice and workflow is very helpful, and we've been successful in creating some nice images. But a totally HDR focused video shader attended solution will just give us that much more and a little bit more pristine product.
Sure. So is your lab still working? Do you still have your little
It comes and goes, Ken, because sometimes the equipment that I've borrowed gets somebody calls for it to go back, and and then we make our case, and then it comes back. So it's actually back in a form that's back right now. So yeah.
do you recommend that other people in the industry do what you're doing in really kind of embracing an experimental place where you can kind of test the content the best way to produce it? Should others be following your lead, or do you like being the?
No, we're one participant and sort of mixed in and working with others who are also practicing and making an HDR contribution and finding solutions. We like to join with those guys to understand, maybe practices and find that common workflow. So no, we're not alone. We're not. We have an offering and we contribute, and there's a lot of other good input as well. So and it's all towards. I think it's something that people are looking for. We'd like to get there sooner than later.
Right. So with the work you've done so far, what do you see as the two biggest things out there, or what's the biggest thing out there that still kind of gives you pause on the future of HDR, just where, what needs to be solved near term?
Yeah, it's finding that good point of reference, that delivery chain, the complete delivery, so the ecosystem right to the target home set. That destination display that we're all going to be feeding into. I think that's maturing a lot more. We're seeing a lot better capabilities in the TV set side to actually receive what it is that we're going to be able to produce. I think on the production side, we have a couple of good offerings that we can work in. I don't know if it's going to be like in our 720 1080i kind of world where, okay, what flavor are we doing today, and can we just capably and easily move back and forth between that or not? That may be a requirement down the line. I don't know,
But how do you think this gets sorted out? I mean, Mark, you guys are on the distribution side.
Yeah, so that's kind of where our sweet spot is right now. What we're playing to is how do we feed the mothership, and get it back into charter land. So what we've done today is taken our SD, our feed of the Sportsnet for the Dodgers, and just putting it on through some technology, through Technicolor, and upconverted it and let it ride through when we're passing it through to give it the all the way through to the set-top box.
Right.
So that's kind of where we see, it's great when we're doing a live production in HDR, but there's, 20 hours of other content that you got to air throughout the day, and you got all this archival content that you're not going to just sort of bounce back and forth. So you want to try and create a steady look throughout. So we're looking at some, of their technology to how to take the SDR and archival content and push it through as an HDR flavor. And we're delivering it to a set-top box to the set and seeing how it has an effect. And it, when you take and run it through this upconvert technology, it does have a substantial impact, so it does look good. And the nice thing is the cable plant loves it because it's no additional payload on their backbone. So it's, they can get it straight to the home and let the signaling happen at the TV set. So.
Right. So I guess Josh is going to, from Technicolor, will discuss that workflow
Correct.
a little bit.
Yeah.
So, so is your recommendation then that people should look to produce the top events in HDR, proper HDR, you see the SDR to HDR conversion as a viable alternative?
I see that as a step as we go through, as we've done, we had to convert SD to HD and similar. I think we're going to go through that similar, say, time frame and situation again. We've tested, because, look, there's so many trucks out there, and I mean, we all love all the manufacturers to build HDR capable trucks out of the gate, but, as an RSN, you can't afford that every time. So, maybe there's a step along the way, and we've been testing, we just took our just standard SDR feed and 1080i and passed it through, and it looked okay. Now we've taken it to 1080p, passed it through, and it looks that much better. So that may be, that's the thing that Phil's talking about, whether you're 1080p or 4K. So I think it has a major impact as you get further back into the process and can get it more native. It looks a lot better. So I think those will be stepping stones along the way till we make that full migration over to a full HDR flow from start to end.
So when it comes to game day and the event starts, so how does HDR change the way? I mean, we talked about the shaders a little bit, and I guess the camera guys still just shoot the show the way I always shoot it. The camera guys still want to shoot. They don't want to have to worry about color.
Yeah, in fact, I don't know of any I'm not aware of a camera viewfinder that is HDR.
Yeah.
So, but that doesn't matter.
So who has to work differently in the truck, or is it pretty straightforward?
The shader.
The shader, other than shader.
We're going to have a revolt from shaders if we don't give the shader the tools and the monitoring to do the job properly. And I mean, that's critical.
Right. I mean, there are some other components when you bolt on shop boxes and graphics and things like that. Those have an impact as well as you lay them in there because they tend to clip the whites and everything else. So you got to be careful of those devices. So as you're setting it up,
Right.
So now if you're doing a 4K game, every source has to be 4K or up converted to 4K. Right. When you do a 4K HDR game, now every source has to be non-4K HDR has to be up converted to 4K and up converted to HDR. And now we're going to start having latency issues. And so there's a bunch of stuff to overcome. But in terms of what the producer and director and in terms of everybody working in the truck other than the shader and the engineers, it's a slam dunk. That's not a problem.
Right.
Ken, can I ask Phil, if you're shooting just HDR and you're not concerned about SDR for this question, isn't it a lot easier for the video guy? You shade for APL, you don't worry about the highlights, you just let them go.
Absolutely. It's much easier to shade if all your shading is for HDR, but I don't see that happening anytime in the near future.
Plus you've got the dye.
Shut yourself off.
I think I'm out of battery. Maybe I'll take that. Thanks. Plus you've got the color issue as well. We've had several instances where footage has come from Japan in HDR, and it is, to quote and this was a short cine project. To quote the cinematographer, he said, "Oh, I must have taken acid." But that's a intrinsic decision, cultural decision. They want to boost the colors. They want to do all that. So it's not just a matter of dynamic range and making the APL work. You've also got to worry about the colors of everything as well. And different countries are going to have different tastes on what is normal color.
Well, does this also change the way sets are? You think this will change the way we had this with HD, the way sets are designed, or the kind of clothes that people wear, or because you can actually see things that you've never saw before.
Can I steal one? So the three things we've noticed, both in the lab and also at the NAB booth, is that when you have a discrepancy in degrees Kelvin of your lighting, so in standard dynamic range, you can be a couple hundred degrees out, nobody will ever notice, the camera will never pick it up. You start doing HDR, that couple of hundred degrees is going to be on there. The second one is the hardness of the shadows. Because of the SDR dithering, everything goes nice and soft in a shadow. In HDR, you're going to get harder shadows. So then your lighting is going to have to change. And the last one is the directionality of the lighting. So you have two lights on somebody, one's 100%, one's 90%. You're never going to notice in standard dynamic range. You do HDR, you're going to start noticing one is brighter than the other.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, just relative to that scene and what you're actually capturing is one of the things that we've noticed is that in a venue where you're shooting hockey or basketball, whatever, a lot of that signboard stuff, particularly when you're in 20/20 color space and you are working in HDR, it all becomes very vibrant and quite bold, and it's almost a distraction. It takes you away from the subject that you're maybe focused on, which is the game. There's a lot of elements in the background that suddenly now become very prominent that you might consider maybe somewhat of the negative part of HDR. It's brilliant. Some of the signboard stuff, if you're an advertiser in that space, you're going to be really happy. But it is a distraction in the way that the crowd now becomes more better definition on the crowd because it is brighter. You've lifted that up, and so there's more information in the scene.
Even if you don't go all the way to 20/20 color, just increasing the contrast range increases the saturation of the existing colors. So that, you're right, Mike.
As you increase the dome, if you will, of color, this sounds like I'm in stereo. The dome of color, the colors get brighter, but they also get very, very rich as well, which is exactly what you were talking about with the signboards in the background. You start doing 20/20, the colors are not only brighter, but they're richer, so they really jump out at you.
Well, Mark, you mentioned for your shaders, you mentioned the Dodgers, the home jerseys, issue of some. So talk about that issue and kind of.
Yeah, it was interesting when we initially set it up and we were doing a dusk to night game. So we thought we may have to build some profiles for the shaders. But once we got it set to 1, it actually worked pretty well through the transition of sunlight to darkness. But when we were doing this SDR event, through this upconverted technology, the white, just the contrast of Chavez Ravine at nighttime was just stunning. I mean, just the grass was just beautiful, and just the backdrop and everything looked gorgeous. But these Dodger jerseys are as white can be, and they're clipping it, and so you're losing the detail. But it was a little challenging, but it's got a bit of a wow factor to it. So it's really impressive. So.
And Mike, you mentioned I'm guessing for hockey there could be issues with the ice, right, where it could kind of be a little bright. Is that true, or you mentioned bright scenes? I'm guessing ice can.
Yeah, certainly you get, and those bright whites, and even as Mark points it out in the Dodger white, same thing in the Blue Jays white jerseys and stuff. Before where it was really just a flat white scene because we would push that right to the limit of our 709 space. Now it actually gets rendered with a lot more detail in the clothes. It's a subtle kind of a change, but it's quite noticeable in when you're capturing that in HDR. And we cover a lot of hockey, of course, and so we pay attention to our ice and how that presents itself. We have kind of a target level that we like to use in our 709 space, but the rendering of that ice now is, again, because you're working in that HDR space, you actually get more of kind of the contouring of the ice, the marks, the skate blades and stuff. It's just more detail that starts to show up. Again, that's another point of maybe taking away from the main.
Because even in baseball, you can actually read body ink now. I mean, it's that incredible in terms of the detail. So you see these guys with these tattoos. It's pretty impressive.
So last question, because obviously we'll have some good presentations in a couple minutes. That'll give a nice overview from Dolby, Technicolor, and Sony on sort of their philosophies towards HDR. But for someone who has not really started investigating HDR yet, who's in the audience, where should they get started? I mean, how do they even, you go around, you see a nice HDR monitor, you say, ooh, that looks really pretty, I want to do this. So what should be their first step?
Buy a TV that accepts HDR. That's a step one, but of course they're not going to be able to see it until, I guess they got to go to the shows, NAB and so on, and hear and see demonstrations of it. But I think within a year for sure, you're going to see HDR out there on various kinds of telecasts.
Can you do a simple production in HDR? Can you do a simple 3-camera shoot, just experimenting, or how easy is it to sort of experiment in HDR?
We've been doing full-blown productions of major league events in HDR, we got to learn from it. One of the issues we haven't talked about, especially in the conversion part of HDR, SDR, HDR, is noise. In 4K, noise is a big problem in the for encoders, and so we have to be really careful about the noise. I realize that's not your question, but I don't think it's going to be too long before we see it. And then everybody's going to be struggling with their TVs, even the ones that are supposedly HDR compatible. You go and now you're getting into the menus and you're messing with it, and there's going to be a period of time here where people are going to be saying, you know, I think I like plain old SDR HD. It looks better than my 4K HDR because they've set up their TV sets incorrectly. And that was true of the early days, if you recall, of surround sound and Dolby. You know, you'd go and, you know, it was you wouldn't hear the mix or the background, you wouldn't hear the lead singer or whatever, or the narration. So it's going to be tough for a while.
Right.
But we'll end up in a better place.
Sure, sure. So anybody else, as far as, I mean, Mike,
Well, I was going to say, Ken, that it all ends up on the consumer TV. Everything we do, whether it's pre-recorded and graded or whether it's live, which is much more difficult, it ends up on a consumer TV. And one of the issues that I heard was HDR compatible. And that was kind of a misnomer. That wasn't really an HDR TV. Today, the CTA calls that ultra premium, UHD ultra premium. That is a UHD HDR TV. HDR compatible 4K TVs are not really guaranteed to handle HDR10 and all the other versions. So there's a difference there. And I think that as we work through this process, the consumers will get wiser and be buying true HDR TVs.
Great, excellent. Well, thanks, guys, for your time. So, quick round of applause.